right, hello everyone. My name is Becky Leonard, and I'm going to be sharing with you my dissertation study titled Stigma, Sense of Belonging, and Educational Outcomes, a quantitative approach to understanding the internal lateral transfer student experience. This topic is inspired by my work as the Assistant Director for Transition Programs at Penn State, and the internal lateral transfer student population is one that I'm really passionate about. When I first considered this topic, I knew why it would be significant to me because of the connection to my work. But once I dove into the literature, I increasingly learned that the significance of this research extends beyond just me. When I was beginning to gather research on the topic, I noticed a huge gap in the literature. I could only find 2 studies that utilized a sample similar to mine, and one of them was published in March of 2023, so pretty recently. Literature that focuses on lateral transfer students exists, but it is in much fewer quantities than studies that focus on students transferring from a 2-year to a 4-year institution or a vertical transfer. Even harder to find in my review of the literature was a focus on students transferring from one campus to another within a multi-campus institution. And like I said, only 2 research studies use this population. Because research is sparse on this student population, despite thousands of students making this type of transition each year, my study fills a need in the literature of transfer studies. While I dove into various facets of the transfer student experience as I conducted my literature review, 3 main topics dominated my study: transfer shock, belonging, and stigma. In his 1965 seminal work, Hills coined the term transfer shock to describe the trend that students transferring from junior colleges to 4-year institutions experienced a dip in their GPA post-transition, and he cited evidence of this all the way back to the 1920s. Hills really laid the groundwork for future investigations into the academic experience of transfer students. And then decades later, there is evidence that transfer students still continue to experience transfer shock. Up until the Jaggers et al. 2023 study, no research had been conducted on whether internal lateral transfer students experience transfer shock. They were the first to look at that. Just as transfer students have difficulty adjusting to the new academic environment, the social environment of the receiving institution also poses challenges. One element of transfer student social adjustment is the development of a sense of belonging. My study utilizes Strayhorn's 2019 definition of sense of belonging as students perceive social support, connectedness, and mattering on campus. For some transfer students, their social adjustment and development of a sense of belonging may also be impeded by stigma. In multiple studies, I found transfer students reported feeling a stigma associated with their transfer identity. Notably, the research on transfer students' experiences with belonging and stigma do not focus solely on lateral transfer students. In the research I found, the studies either focused exclusively on vertical transfer students, or the studies did not separate vertical and lateral transfer students, and the results were discussed in aggregate. My study integrated current knowledge from the field of transfer studies to investigate how stigma and belonging influence internal lateral transfer students' educational outcomes, and I was using post-transition GPA as the outcome of investigation. And like I kind of alluded to before, prior to this study, no research has directly tied together the concepts of transfer shock, belonging, and stigma for the student population. The theoretical framework I used to ground my study was Schlossberg's transition theory. And while all aspects of this theory are relevant to my study, the 2 factors that are most notable are the self and strategy factors. The self factor of Schlossberg's theory includes demographic characteristics and psychological resources to cope with the transition. I found in the literature many studies showing how demographic characteristics may influence transfer student experiences. Additionally, Schlossberg indicates that one aspect of the psychological resources that assist with coping with a transition is self-efficacy, which is often part of the literature on transfer student capital. The degree to which a student possesses transfer capital and self-efficacy can have a significant influence on the coping skills they're able to implement during their transition. This is important because, as I'll discuss a little later in this presentation, transfer capital and coping skills were predictors of student experiences. My study utilized participants from one land-grant multi-campus institution in the Mid-Atlantic region, where approximately 2,500 students transitioned from a regional campus to the flagship campus each year. For this study, I focused solely on the fall 2023 cohort of students who transitioned from a regional campus to the flagship campus. I collected data using a combination of survey data and institutional data. Students completed a survey that was comprised of two existing instruments, the non-transfer student questionnaire as modified by Moser and the Sense of Social Fit scale. In addition to the survey, I obtained consent from the participants to gather their institutional data, specifically term GPA, to measure educational outcomes. And in total, 349 students completed the survey and consented to the use of their GPA for this study. This study investigated three primary research questions. One, do internal lateral transfer students experience transfer shock? Two, is there a relationship between student self-reported experiences with stigma related to their internal transfer student identity and post-transfer GPA? And three, which student characteristics are influential in internal lateral transfer students' experience with belonging and stigma? To answer these research questions, I used a non-experimental correlational explanatory research design. To determine if the students experienced transfer shock, I employed a two-tail Wilcoxon-Stein rank test. To answer the second research question, a set of linear regressions were estimated. They included the dependent variable in one of the regressions as students post-transition GPA and their fall 2023 GPA, and the independent variables were the reported experience with stigma, and then the second one was their reported sense of belonging post-transition. And in both of these regressions, demographic variables were held constant. To answer the third research question, I conducted an exploratory factor analysis of the belonging questions, and regressions were estimated to determine which student characteristics, serving as the independent variables, influenced student sense of belonging, acting as the dependent variable. An additional regression was estimated where the student characteristics served as the independent variable, and the dependent variable in this one was the composite variable created from the stigma questions. This image integrates elements from the literature and my theoretical framework and serves as the conceptual framework for the study, where in both students' sense of belonging post-transition and their experience with stigma post-transition were investigated in relationship to the students' educational outcomes. Using this framework and the methods I described previously, I was able to answer the research questions. So let's discuss the findings of this study. My next three slides will explicate what the analyses revealed for each research question, and then I'll dive into the implication of these findings. By analyzing the students' GPAs, it could be ascertained whether the students experienced transfer shock. If their fall 2023 GPA was lower than their pre-transition spring 2023 GPA, then transfer shock would be evident. The present study's analyses revealed that, yes, 63% of the students experienced transfer shock with a median dip in GPA of 0.2 GPA points. This finding confirms the present study's hypothesis that internal lateral transfer students would experience transfer shock. This finding is also consistent with the one other research study, Jaggers et al. 2023, that investigated whether the internal lateral transfer students in their study experienced transfer shock. So these two studies suggest that this student population is vulnerable to a dip in their GPA post-transition. Like I mentioned before, the study is the first to explore the relationship between stigma, belonging, and post-transfer GPA for this population. And the regression analyses revealed that stigma did not have a statistically significant effect on these educational outcomes. And students' overall sense of belonging did not influence their GPA drop between the fall and spring, or their first semester post-transition GPA. So these findings support the null hypothesis and do not show evidence of support for my study's hypotheses, which were that one, experiencing stigma would have a negative effect on students' post-transfer GPA, and two, that belonging and post-transfer GPA would be positively associated. Evidence of this was not found in my present study. One reason for the lack of this evidence could be the timing of the survey administration. The students completed the survey 3 months into their first semester at the flagship campus, and they may not have been exposed to scenarios in which they experienced stigma, which they would have indicated on the survey. Most students reported not experiencing stigma related to their internal transfer student identity. However, those who did experience the stigma were more likely to experience it from their peers rather than faculty in the classroom. Those students' sense of belonging did not influence positively or negatively post-transition GPA or the difference between semesters. Students indicated a sense of belonging across most of the post-transition belonging questions of the survey. So like I said before, the survey was provided to students 3 months into their first semester at the flagship campus. So 3 months post-transition, students felt like they had found their place at their new campus. My study also explored student demographics, which were campus of origin, academic college, gender, housing situation, and race ethnicity, and student characteristics such as transfer capital, coping skills, and involvement. The analyses explored whether these characteristics predicted students' likelihood to experience stigma and their sense of belonging. This chart displays how the student characteristics played out in the regression analyses. Interestingly, the race, ethnicity, and gender variables were not statistically significant in any of the belonging or stigma analyses. And even though there wasn't a significant effect with these variables, that does not mean that these identities were uninfluential in the students' actual lived experiences. Though these two variables did not appear significant in the models, all other student characteristics were significant in at least one model. Academic college was a significant predictor of students' belonging through sense of fit, belonging through personal connections, and belonging through faculty interactions. One reason academic college is a predictor of sense of belonging is that different colleges offer different resources and support services tailored to the needs of their students. Students who are part of a college that prioritizes research, such as advising, programming designed just for internal lateral transfer students, or research opportunities may feel more supported and engaged in their academic journey. Within academic colleges, students often share academic experience, courses, and faculty members, and this shared experience can foster a sense of community among students, making it easier for them to connect with their peers and form meaningful relationships. Housing was a significant predictor of students' sense of belonging through social activities. Students living on campus were more likely to report a greater sense of belonging through social activities than students who lived off campus. While over 76% of the study's sample lived off campus, those who lived in the residence hall experienced a greater sense of belonging, and proximity to social activities may be one factor in explaining this phenomenon. Campus of origin was a significant predictor of both sense of belonging through personal connection and overall sense of belonging. Students who transitioned from a regional campus with over 1,000 students reported a greater sense of belonging through personal connections than students from campuses with fewer than 1,000 students. Students from these larger campuses also fared better than students from campuses with fewer than 500 students, reporting a greater overall sense of belonging. In this study, students from larger regional campuses had a smoother social transition than students from smaller regional campuses. One possible explanation for this is that students from larger regional campuses may be more accustomed to taking the initiative to find their fit and social circle in a larger sea of students. Transfer capital was a significant predictor of both belonging through faculty interactions and overall sense of belonging. In both instances, students with greater levels of reported transfer capital had higher levels of belonging. Students' level of involvement on campus predicted their belonging through sense of fit, belonging through personal connections, and belonging through social activities. These increased feelings of belonging in these areas are a natural side effect of being more involved. When students are more involved, they are more inclined to have personal connections and be engaged in social activities. Students' involvement on campus also predicted their reported experience with stigma related to their internal lateral transfer student identity. In the present study, students who were more involved on campus reported experiencing less stigma. Despite the potential stigma they may face, students may still choose to become involved on campus and actively seek out those opportunities for engagement. In these cases, involvement may serve as a means of challenging stereotypes, building relationships, and finding a sense of belonging despite initial perceptions or biases. The only student characteristic that was statistically significant in all of the regression models was coping skills, which underscores their importance in helping students manage challenges and adapt to new environments. In the 5 belonging analyses, students who had greater levels of coping skills reported a greater sense of belonging. Conversely, students who reported greater coping skills also reported experiencing more stigma. And this result was surprising, but it does reveal that students who have greater coping skills may be more equipped to handle the situations they encounter where their internal lateral transfer student identity is marginalized. Coping skills played a pivotal role for students in navigating the challenges and stressors inherent with their identity of an internal lateral transfer student. I mentioned previously that Schlossberg's transition theory served as theoretical framework for this study, and these findings are well aligned with this framework. For example, transfer capital and coping skills were influential in students' experiences post-transition, and these two concepts are closely tied to Schlossberg's model. Schlossberg's theory suggests that individuals draw upon their resources, including transfer capital, to cope with transitions effectively. So students may leverage their prior classroom experience, the resources that they had access to at their campus of origin, and the skills they learned before and during the transition to navigate challenges and adapt to the flagship campus. Students who can utilize adaptive coping strategies such as seeking support, developing problem-solving skills, and maintaining a positive outlook may experience a smoother transition to the flagship campus. Schlossberg's theory provides a framework for understanding the factors that influence the internal lateral transfer students and how they navigated the transition. So what does this all mean? When practitioners gain insights into how internal lateral transfer students experience belonging and stigma post-transition, they're better able to support this population. For example, 62% of the students indicated that they felt it was a mystery how the flagship campus worked. Knowing this, more structured and targeted support can be implemented to familiarize these students with the resources, the policies, and the unwritten rules of the flagship campus. This content could be included in orientation programming. Similarly, an emphasis on academic skills could help smooth the transition for these students. Students who are making the transition should be aware of the possibility of experiencing transfer shock. It shouldn't be kept a secret. This topic should be discussed early on during orientation programming for these students. This proactive approach to informing students about transfer shock would allow them to take the steps to prepare for the academic transition, as well as normalize the experience of transfer shock. Post-transition programming could also include ways to improve academic skills, workshops and programs that emphasize the different ways to build academic skills, and the availability of resources could help stave off some of the effects of transfer shock. As we saw, coping skills played a major role in the students' transition. Institutions could utilize this knowledge to offer programming and services to assist students in developing these coping skills. Both individual counseling sessions and group workshops could be venues for these students to acquire more coping skills and ultimately improve their post-transition experiences. And no stigma on campus was not a universal experience in this study. Some students did report feeling stigmatized inside and outside of the classroom. This is concerning, and practices could be implemented to help mediate a culture of stigmatization. For example, providing faculty with information regarding the internal lateral transfer student experience could help them conceptualize their adjustment needs and potentially lead to more empathy towards the student population. Similarly, raising awareness of the student population among the flagship campus student population could prevent negative feelings towards this group. Creating inclusive campus environments where these students feel valued and supported can foster a greater sense of belonging and mitigate these experiences with stigma. By integrating theory-driven approaches with practical strategies, institutions can better support internal lateral transfer students' belonging and contribute to their overall success. My study was not without its limitations. One of the limitations of this study was the diversity presented in the study sample. While the sample size was sufficient, a more varied sample could have provided insight in different ways. Another limitation was that it only focused on students from one multi-campus institution, and because of this, results may not be generalizable across other institutions. Similarly, the study only explored the experiences of students transferring from a regional campus to the flagship campus, within the institution. And students who transfer from one regional campus to another or who leave the flagship campus for a regional campus may have experiences that are not represented in the findings of this study. And lastly, this study relied on attitudinal measures with students self-reporting their experiences on a survey. And this could lead to discrepancies in the accuracy of their responses and their lived experiences. I'm excited that my study is helping to bring this student population into the field of transfer studies, and more research should continue. Future research could expand the student characteristics that are explored. My study explored 8 student characteristics, but we all know there are more to students than those 8 things. And this would help scholars develop more nuanced models that capture the complexities of belonging and stigma. Future research could also explore the role different student characteristics play and how these students experience transfer shock. For example, is there a predicted relationship between some demographic variable and transfer shock? The present study only investigated transfer shock after 1 semester at the new campus, and continued research is needed to understand GPA performance across multiple semesters post-transition. Both transfer capital and coping skills proved to be significant in the results of this study and are worthy of further exploration with the student population. The influence coping skills had on participants cannot be overstated. However, very few studies have explored the influence of coping skills on the transfer student experience, and this is a valuable area for future research. My last suggestion for future research would be to employ qualitative research methods to this topic. Integrating the students' voices into a research study regarding their experience could provide a richer depth of insight and authentic context that is not available through quantitative methods alone. The purpose of this research study was to explore the interconnectedness of belonging, stigma, and educational outcomes for the internal lateral transfer student population at one institution. The study confirmed that internal lateral transfer students experience transfer shock. Though there was not a relationship between students' self-reported experiences with stigma and their post-transfer GPA, there were relationships between student sense of belonging, stigma, and student characteristics. Understanding this relationship allows student affairs practitioners and institutions to examine how they support the student population. The experiences of internal lateral transfer students are valid and important, though they are often left out of the conversation, both within institutions and within the literature in the field of transfer studies. As the landscape of higher education continues to evolve and more students view a campus change within a large multi-campus institution as a viable option, understanding the student population is critical. This study begins to fill that gap in the literature and opens doors for future research on internal lateral transfer students. I would like to say thank you to everyone who has supported me in this research, whether directly or indirectly. Dr. Fenster has been an immeasurably helpful chair, and the insights of Dr. Griffith and Dr. Rosenberg have been absolutely influential in the development of this study. I also could not have done it without my family, friends, and colleagues, some of whom are watching today. And lastly, I would like to say thank you to the internal lateral transfer students that I have the pleasure of working with. They're such a special, impressive, and important group, and it has been an honor to give voice to their experiences through this study. I am happy to answer any questions you have or provide clarity.